I think oftentimes in this country things are presented as if the country were extremely polarized, and gun violence and gun control is one of those issues where a lot of people might make you believe that people are either for or completely opposed to gun control. I don't think that's actually the case. I think a lot of gun owners, especially once they understand that gun control doesn't mean somebody's going to take your gun away, are in fact in favor of some restrictions. And I'm sending around 2 reports, one of them from Amnesty International, the executive summary. Then some of the information from that report you're also going to find in the presentation today. Shirley Chambers, a woman from Chicago, lost all four of her children to gun violence. So this is extreme case scenario. Starting in the 1990s, her son Carlos was shot near his school. In 2000, her daughter Latoya shot in the lobby of her housing complex. In 2000, her son Jerome shot while using the payphone outside of his complex. And then in 2013, her son Ronnie shot. So one of the things I really want people to remember as I'm proceeding through my presentation is, at the end of the day, it all boils down to very personal issues. And if you've lost someone through gun violence, it's going to affect you in a very personal way. So these are just the numbers for 2016. We have over 38,000 people in that year died from firearms. That's an average of 100 people a day. What is also very significant about that number is about 2/3, over 60 people a day, die from suicide committed with guns. So that is staggering. So it's not just the homicide that we need to look at, it's the suicide rate that we need to look at. We have some gun deaths that were unintentional, we have some that are undetermined, and then we have some that are so-called legal interventions. That means law enforcement, right? And for more information, check out Centers for Disease Control, and that website is cdc.gov. So I'm going to give you the perspective of human rights organizations. So some of my information comes from United Nations and some of their reports. And here we have the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Given the potential harm and devastating impact of the misuse of firearms on the enjoyment of human rights, public policies with respect to civilian access to firearms should be reviewed and formulated through a human rights lens. So that's basically the argument that I'm going to make throughout this presentation. First of all, human rights are essential, they're important, right? They're universal, they apply to everybody. And also, secondly, the protection of human rights is actually one of the obligations that states have. So looking at the report, In the Line of Fire, Human Rights and the U.S. Gun Violence Crisis, this is reiterated, right? The duty of states is protect the lives of citizens. And under international human rights law, states have an obligation to exercise adequate control over the purchase, possession, and use of arms by private actors in the face of clear evidence of persistent firearms violence. So with human rights, we have some precursors to human rights that go back, you can find it in the Enlightenment or even before. But modern human rights, that framework comes into existence after World War II in 1948. We have the 30 Articles, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we have subsequent treaties that are international treaties, some of which the U.S. has signed, some of which the U.S. has signed and ratified. And among those are the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And both of these, the U.S. has not only signed, but also ratified. Other human rights treaties. We have one on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, Convention of the Rights of the Child, And then the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These the United States has not ratified. Some of these have been signed, but even if the U.S. has not ratified it, there's still a legal obligation to protect and uphold those rights. And just as a reminder, you know, some people may think, well, international treaties are not that important. We actually do have a provision in the U.S. Constitution, Article 6 of the Constitution, stating as followed, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So in short, what that means is once the United States has signed and ratified a treaty, that treaty is binding by law, and that treaty supersedes domestic law. Having said that, Congress generally does not ratify a treaty unless it is already in line with, you know, what we have, for example, in the way of either protections through law or through the Constitution. So in terms of gun ownership, we have, and these are the latest figures, it's probably higher by now, we have in this country close to 400 million guns. So that averages out to about 120 guns per 100 people. This is a very high gun ownership rate. In fact, the U.S. represents ballpark about 5% of the world's population, and we have ballpark 40% of the world's guns, and we're talking about individual private gun ownership, right? We're not talking about soldiers in the army, right? So this is very high, and of course the highest if we're looking at Western industrialized countries. Yemen is the second in gun ownership. Switzerland, a European country, is third. So the U.S. not only has very high gun ownerships, but also very high homicide rates, very high suicide rates. So it's not just a problem by a little bit, but the U.S. is actually a significant outlier when it comes to gun-related problems. The American Journal of Medicine, but that's not the only journal, you can find this information all over, will basically tell you, again, that the U.S. is a leader when it comes to gun homicides. In terms of rate per 100,000 residents, it's 3.6% in the U.S. If you compare that to Japan, 0.01%, right? I think it's 16 times the rate of Germany. In some reports, you're going to find 25 times the rate of other Western industrialized countries. So some of these reports, you may say, well, the statistics vary. The statistics may vary. Some of it depends on exactly what time period we're looking at. For example, but ballpark is, right, we have a problem that is significantly higher than it is in other comparable countries. Now, in terms of human rights, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 30 articles. They were adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. And we have some of the subsequent treaties, and some of these I just mentioned. So when it comes to the obligations of a state, right, one of the primary fundamental obligations that a state has, and it's not just the United States, it's every state, that every state has, is to protect its citizens. So the right to life, the right to security of persons is paramount, it's fundamental. It's extremely important. But we also, we in the sense of, you know, the state or the government also has an obligation to protect vulnerable populations, right? And that includes, for example, children, it includes women, it includes minorities. So when it comes to vulnerable populations, they tend to be disproportionately affected by gun violence in this country. So African Americans, many of you know, represent approximately 13% of the people here in the United States, but they represent almost 60% of homicide victims. So that is definitely in and of itself very disproportional. Obviously, a lot of that has to do with gang violence in the inner cities, but one of the larger questions then we need to ask ourselves is why? Why is that the case? And if we actually try to understand underlying causes, it is actually a lot harder to address those problems and to come up with solutions than it is to just look at the issue from a gun ownership perspective. A black male between the ages of 15 and 34 is between 16 and 20 times as likely to be murdered than a white male in the same age range. So there's a significant risk, and a lot of it depends really on which neighborhood you live in and what other circumstances you have to deal with. But there's definitely a failure on behalf of the government, a failure to protect here. We also have protection internationally, the right to life and the right to non-discrimination under international law. If we look at children, a lot of children in this country not only live in homes where guns are present, but we have millions of them living in homes where guns are not locked up. So kids have easy access to guns, right? They're supposed to be locked up, but you get a lot of accidents because of that. So if you're looking at it, just again, statistics for last year alone, over 1,600 children died from firearm-related violence. And again, you know, what's really striking here is we have a lot of homicides, but we also have really a lot of suicides. And that, if we're to look at it as a societal problem, why is it? Why is it that so many people in this country feel that this is a way out, that their life is so desperate or they're so distraught that that's the way out? This is really, it's a big problem, right? And just looking at it from the perspective of gun ownership or, you know, gun laws is really only addressing the tip of the iceberg, if you will. Let me just also say at this juncture, when it comes to suicides, we lose every single day a lot of veterans to suicide. And in fact, we lose more veterans to suicide than we lose soldiers during combat. And that, you know, again, if we look at larger societal problems, that's huge, right? That's huge, and we really need to address that. According to the Convention of the Rights of the Child, states have an obligation especially to provide and safeguard the care, and a child being defined here as being 17 years or younger. Again, if we were to compare it with other Western industrialized countries, sometimes you're going to hear other high-income countries, basically meaning the same group. If we're going to compare it with Western Europe, you know, Australia, Japan, and so on, we definitely have the highest rate of gun deaths, and we also have the highest rate of gun ownership, but also the highest rate of children killed with guns. And there are definitely laws that can be enacted to prevent a lot of it. So I don't think that parents necessarily leave their guns unlocked with the vision of their kids, you know, shooting somebody or shooting themselves, right? But unfortunately, that does all too often happen. So, you know, when we think of, well, what could be happening, I think even from the perspective of gun owners, I don't think there is a gun owner who would like to see their kid injured or killed by a gun, right? So these are measures that I think would be or should be very uncontroversial. But right now, so if 23 states have failed to enact such laws, it also means that we do have 27 that did, right? So a lot of legislation is going to happen on the state level. We don't really have clear policies on the federal level. Everytown Research, that's an organization dedicated to this type of research. And so if we look at women, right, women and gun violence, according to their research, women in the U.S. are 16 times more likely to be killed by a gun than, again, women in other, high-income, Western industrialized countries. And so what happens a lot is, people have disagreements, right? People have arguments, you might get strained relationships. But what oftentimes makes the difference is whether or not a gun is present in the house, right? Somebody may lose their temper, right? But if there's no gun present in the house, they may blow off steam in different ways, right? So a lot of times what happens, and in the case of suicides too, right? If there's a gun available, people may use that. And when it comes to suicides, as an aside, that mostly affects white men. When it comes to homicides, that mostly affects black men. If somebody is triggered and very desperate, just not having a gun available, right? Once they cool off or calm down or have a chance to talk things over with somebody, that moment of suicidal tendencies may pass, right? So that's another really important issue to look at. And in the case of domestic violence, that not having a gun on the premise can make a huge difference. So some of these statistics are really staggering. And it's really boggling the mind, for example, that nearly 1 million women alive today have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner. That's a staggering number, right? It's really almost hard to imagine. Or that approximately 4.5 million American women alive today have been threatened with a gun. Think about that for a moment. That's staggering, right? That's staggering. When it comes to domestic partner violence, black women are more likely to be shot than white women. But, let me just say with domestic violence, this is not just a problem here in this country. Domestic violence, it affects women all over the world. Some estimates say that 1 out of every 3 women in her lifetime will be assaulted or sexually assaulted. That's 1 out of 3. That's really a very sobering statistic as well. And so domestic violence, it's not a quote-unquote American problem. It's really around the world. So that's to keep in mind. And also, domestic violence happens across all ethnic groups and across all classes. So just because somebody is wealthy doesn't mean that they're less likely to engage in domestic violence than somebody who's poor. So it kind of cuts across all sectors of society. When it comes to looking at why people are killed, if you are, and again, if we're looking at homicides for a moment, if you're a black male in the inner city, your chances are greater that you're going to be killed, let's say, because of gang rivalry. But for women who are killed, a huge percentage of that is because of intimate partner violence. And so it may be a spouse or an ex-spouse, right? A boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, maybe the father of her children. And obviously domestic violence can affect men as well. So I'm not saying this is only a problem that affects women, but it disproportionately affects women. So let's say you have, you're in a relationship, right? And you have a partner who is controlling, right? Who is threatening you. What can you do about it? You may or may not be able to leave that situation. It's sometimes really difficult to get out of these types of situations. If you do, if you can, one of the ways to protect yourself is by getting a so-called order of protection. So what does an order of protection do? An order of protection may say, okay, so-and-so, let's say your partner, so-and-so is not allowed to come to your apartment or your house, is not allowed to call and harass you, is not allowed to send you threatening messages through the mail or through email or text or whatever, right? It's oftentimes these agreements basically, or these orders of protection basically say no contact, right? Now, and again, there are differences from one state to the next, but if you have an order of protection, first of all, you get people who violate it, so that in and of itself is no guarantee that you're not going to be exposed to violence. But also in many states, the laws basically apply to, okay, if it's an order of protection dealing with spouses, ex-spouses, dealing with somebody you live with, right, like a live-in boyfriend, that applies. And if there is an order of protection in some states, that means that you may have to surrender your gun, right? That's actually not the case in that many states, but if there's an order of protection, right, you may have to relinquish your weapon. This is really not very well enforced. But here's the thing, there's a loophole, right? If it's just somebody that you're dating, right, not a spouse, not an ex-spouse, not the father of your children, not somebody you've lived with, but somebody who you're just dating, that basically then doesn't apply, right? So there's a real loophole with that. So right now we do have 35 states plus Washington, D.C. prohibiting firearm possession by persons subject to a domestic violence restraining order. But only 27 of those states and Washington, D.C. require or authorize that the weapons be relinquished. And in fact, if you look at the practice of it, it's actually really hard to do. But again, whether or not somebody at the moment of passion has access to a weapon or not makes a huge difference. And some of you probably have had experience with intimate partner violence, or maybe somebody in your family has, or in your circle of friends. I would say two things. First of all, definitely get help, right? Reach out. And secondly, understand, if you make a decision, if you end up separating from that person, the moment of separation, that's the moment that is most dangerous, because the separation is still fresh, people are very upset, so you kind of have to take added measures to protect yourself, right? And then if kids are involved, that of course is even more complicated, right? I cannot tell you how many people end up staying in abusive relationships because they don't see another way out, right? Or let's say especially if it's a mother with children, right? And she's afraid that unless she stays in the relationship, that she cannot protect the children from further harm, right? Sometimes people make these rational decisions based on how can we minimize harm? How can we minimize potential harm? And from the outside, it may seem like, wow, why is this person staying with this abusive partner? In fact, it may be a very rational decision calculated at, okay, if I split from him, he's going to get more irrational, more violent, and I'm more likely to get killed, and my kids are more likely to get killed, right? So it's like really, really tricky. If any of you know somebody or suspect somebody is in that situation, please be there in terms of solidarity. And there are a lot of organizations in Ithaca, for example, the Advocacy Center that can help, right? But I just really want to stress that all of you in this room, all of you know somebody who's been affected by domestic violence. You may not know it in the sense of people didn't tell you, right? But statistically, right, I mean, think about it. If 1 out of 3 women experiences violence, there are a lot of women, and again, some men, who are going to be dealing with domestic violence on a regular basis. All right, so United Nations Human Rights Council, Statement on Domestic Violence. The state has particularly acute obligations when it comes to protecting the rights of vulnerable groups, including victims of domestic violence, who are most at risk from misuse of a gun in the home. And here's kind of the key. The presence of a gun in the home can easily turn domestic violence into domestic homicide. And that's ultimately what we try to prevent. What I just mentioned to you before is that definitely homicides is a big problem, but we do have a lot of suicides. So if every day 100 people die as a result of gunshot wounds. Over 60 of them are suicides. And if you look at suicides, men and women tend to use different methods, if that's what you want to call, right? So women may be more likely to, try and overdose, use non-violent methods. Men are more likely to use guns, right? And again, it's a question of if there's a gun readily available, the chances is increased that a gun's going to be used. One of the things I really want to briefly mention is every time we have a mass shooting, and mass shootings are very traumatic, mass shootings is kind of what gets our attention. But again, if we lose 100 people every day to guns, that's huge. Right? That's huge. A lot of times, especially when we have mass shootings, a lot of people say, well, that person was mentally unstable, and, if we're going to have gun control, we should just make sure that people with mental illness don't get guns. I would caution against that. First of all, there is a huge range of mental illness. You can have some people who are depressed. You can have a lot of people who are very high functioning, right, who are managing their mental health issues, right? Then you have some people who may be very unstable, right? But ultimately, that decision whether or not somebody is or is not stable has to be done by a medical professional, right? We cannot from a distance say, oh, this person is out of control. We cannot just say, I don't want that person to have a gun and I'm just going to label that person mentally ill. One, it does a disservice, right? Mental illness is a serious problem in this country, as it is in other places as well. And we do need to do a better job dealing with mental health issues. And again, that's very much connected to suicides. It's very much connected to the dislocation that veterans experience, right, when they come back from places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Don't fall into this trap of thinking that people who suffer from mental illness are automatically going to be more inclined to commit violent acts. That is not borne out by the facts, right? So basically saying that this is the group of people we need to target is sort of missing the point in a way. Definitely if somebody, let's say, somebody, that person is suicidal, that person has threatened to take their own life. At that moment, right, if somebody poses a risk to themselves, or if somebody has said, I'm going to kill my girlfriend, right, if somebody has actually verbalized that intent, I think at that point intervention is definitely called for, right? The other thing that makes this whole question of mental health very complicated is you may have people with mental health illness who, if they think, once I get diagnosed, I'm not going to be able to buy a gun, and who think, I need a gun to protect myself, right? That somebody in that position may not seek mental health services, right? If they think it might exclude them from, certain rights. So in some states, and again, there are differences from one state to the next, in some states, even if you have laws connected to mental health and gun ownership, usually what that means is you have to have been committed by a health professional, like to an institution, right? Once you have that kind of a paper trail, once you've been institutionalized, then it's more likely that you're going to end up on a list of people restricted from gun purchases, right? People who go talk to their therapist once a week because they have a lot of problems, they're struggling, that's not what we're talking about. Those are not the people who should be restricted from having access. But again, I just really want to stress, when you have these discussions about people who are mentally ill, understand that there's a huge range of mental illness, understand that there's a complexity to the issue, and just scapegoating and blaming people who are suffering from mental illness is really not doing that discussion service. So a lot of times when we think of guns and gun violence in this country, what comes to mind is the number of people killed, right? And I've just done that. the number of people killed on average every day. What we don't really talk about is the other people, many more people who actually survive shootings every day. So while we have 100 people every day who may die as a result of gun violence, we have over 300 people every day who experience gun violence and survive it, right? At least long enough to get to the hospital. So what happens to people with gun-related injuries? What happens to them? Some of you may have had experiences where you had an emergency, you have to go to the doctor, maybe your doctor is not on the same insurance plan as your parents have, whatever. If you ever have a medical emergency and you did not have it covered, you might have a little bit of a sense of how expensive that gets very, very quickly. We had some of the mass shootings at schools, for example. The school may have certain insurance policies, but guess what? Gun violence is not one of them. So let's say if somebody runs you over with a car, your parents may end up getting insurance money or reimbursement or compensation, whatever. If you're killed by a gun, or if you get injured or wounded by a gun, there may not be anything. So it would be an understatement to say that people's lives are irrevocably harmed, changed, altered. That really is an understatement. First of all, you have the physical problems. You might be rushed to emergency services. Just that alone could cost you a couple of thousand, right? Just a visit to the emergency room could cost you a couple of $1,000s. What if you have injuries that require extended stays in the hospital? What if, you were shot and you end up in the intensive care unit for a week or a month, right? What if you become paralyzed, right? What if you become disabled? For some people, it means that medical expenses can run up into the millions of dollars. So that's something when we talk about the cost of gun violence that generally we don't think about. We think about so many people died, right? We don't think about the cost to survivors. And of course, again, if we're looking at it from a human rights perspective, alongside preventative measures, states must provide victims of firearms violence with effective measures of protection and reparation, including access to adequate health care to ensure that they have the best possible chances of survival and rehabilitation, right? And again, if you're shot, your health insurance, there may be a loophole, they may not cover it at all, right? There are some people who were high earners, right? There are people who, were making $80,000 a year, got caught in the crossfire, right? Ended up losing their job, not being able to hold on to their job, and having medical bills over $1 million, right? Going bankrupt, losing their house, losing everything, and living with acute pain for like the rest of their lives, right? So that's an impact again that really should be more central to the conversations that we're having. Some of you may remember Gabby Gifford, a congresswoman who was shot. And after she was shot, and it took her some time, to get physically rehabilitated. But a lot of what she does now is research into gun violence. And there is a Gifford Law Center, right? And for more information, you can go to lawcenter.giffords.org. You can also check out the Brady campaign. But here's what she found. And this, we're talking about every year, right? We're talking about every year. Almost $9 billion we're spending on emergency care on people who've been injured by guns. That's huge. And if you look at long-term care, we're up to over $22 billion. That is almost as high as the entire Medicare program. That's huge. That's huge. If you consider that this cost, much of this, not all of it, but much of this is borne by taxpayers, right? That boils down to like each one of you, right? Your tax burden responsibility is $700, right? just in case you were wondering. All right, so let's take a look at what the situation is in this country today. I'm going to look at a couple of different themes. Background checks. Right now, we do not have a comprehensive, on a federal level, comprehensive, universal background checks. So you kind of have a patchwork. Different states have different laws. We really don't have much going on the federal level. And, states are very protective of their rights. So that's an ongoing struggle. But what that means is 1 out of 5 guns that is transferred, meaning sold, bought, there's no background check at all, right? And so if you think about it, even if you look at it from a law enforcement perspective, those states that have background checks, in those states you're going to get lower homicide rates, lower suicide rates, and you're going to have lower rates of cops being killed on the job. From the perspective of law enforcement, it would be very good to know if a weapon gets recovered, who owns that weapon, right? And right now we don't have a national registry. Information, even with background checks, is only held on to for a very short period of time, right? So it's not so easy for law enforcement to actually determine who the owner of a gun is. So that's kind of a problem. And again, as you can see in the handout here, those states that have mandated universal background checks have 47% fewer women killed in gun violence by an intimate partner, right? And 53% fewer officers killed on duty. And the problem, as I just mentioned, is that we do have a patchwork of laws on the state level. They're inconsistent. And, some states allow open carry, some states allow concealed carry. All states allow the carrying of weapons if they're licensed, right? So let's say if you have someone in law enforcement off duty and so on. Now, here's something very interesting. And when it comes to legislation, when it comes to Congress, most of you will know that the National Rifle Association spends about $3 million every year on supporting certain campaigns. And so they have a lot of lobbying influence, if you will. So we ended up getting, in 1986, the so-called Firearm Owners Protection Act. And I really just learned about that recently. That was really very interesting and somewhat astounding. This is actually a federal law that prohibits the government from requiring a national gun registry. I know of no other country, at least not Western industrialized country, where that's the case, right? And again, if you look at it, not even from the perspective of a potential victim, but from the perspective of law enforcement, that's like a real problem. And that's one of the things that could legislatively be changed. And so the actual act here reads, no such rule, well, this is just an excerpt, right, of the act. No such rule or regulation prescribed by the Attorney General after the enactment of the Firearms Owner Protection Act may require that records required to be maintained, right, under the chapter, or any portion of the contents of such records be recorded at or transferred to a facility owned, managed, or controlled by the United States or any state or any political subdivision thereof. That's astounding. We have a law that limits the federal government's ability to actually keep track of who owns guns. Okay, now this law does not apply retroactively, right? So if we had state laws on the books before 1986, that would still be in force. If law enforcement engages in criminal investigation, right, that also does not apply. But again, a lot of these databases, right, they're only kept short term. All right, registry and training, and this I'm sure most of you are aware of. We do not have a federal law that requires training, licensing or registration of individuals who possess or use firearms. And that's like a big difference You know, sometimes people are comparing gun ownership in the U.S., let's say, with gun ownership in Switzerland. And it's true. In Switzerland, we have very high gun ownership rates. But you also have military service that is mandatory. So basically, people are trained in the military, and the gun that they have, they then take home. But in Switzerland, everybody who owns a gun actually has to be trained. You have to be trained, you have to be licensed. You may think of it from the perspective of, okay, yes, it is true, people do have a right to own guns here, but first of all, the Second Amendment protects the right to gun ownership in the context of militias, right? And an individual gun owner is not a militia. But we recently had a Supreme Court ruling that basically said Second Amendment does apply to individual gun ownership. So a lot of times people use that to say, well, there you go, you know, we have the right. But the Supreme Court decision also says that the state still has the right to control it. So some of you might have cars. I have a car, right? The state can require you to take a written test, to take a driving test, to be licensed to drive, to have a car that passes inspection, to have a car that is registered, to have a car that is inspected, right? All of those things. Yes, you have the right to have a car, you have the right to drive, but the state still has the right to control all of these things. Here's something else that really astounded me when I found out. We don't have any laws requiring that you report it when your gun gets stolen or if you lose it. Wow. You have a gun in your house and somebody steals it, but you're not required to report that? So we have a situation where, according to the FBI, just between 2005 and 2010, 1.4 million firearms were stolen, right? And that more recent statistics indicate that, like every year, about 380,000 guns are stolen. If I were in law enforcement, I would like to know who has those guns, right? That could be very useful. Now here's something else. This one you may have heard of, but we had an amendment. So a lot of times what happens in Congress, if somebody wants to get a bill passed, but they know that the bill would not pass because there's not enough support, a lot of times things are tacked onto spending bills. This is like a very interesting technique, right? So you're going to tack it on as an amendment to a spending bill, and you know, if people don't want the government to shut down, right, they're going to vote on that spending bill, even though an amendment has been tacked on that actually has very little to do with the spending bill, right? So a lot of times things get passed that way in Congress. So there was this very interesting amendment in 1996, and it basically said that part of this appropriation bill, and this is known as the Dickey Amendment, that the Centers for Disease Control are not allowed to use any funding to quote unquote to advocate or promote for gun control. So the amendment doesn't say that the CDC is not allowed to use that money for gun research, but in practice that's basically what it boils down to, right? Because the implication is that if the CDC conducts research on gun violence, that the CDC is then going to say we have a gun violence problem and is going to recommend ABC, we're going to deal with it in that way. So this is really interesting. In essence, the restriction has had a negative impact on research. And here's the thing. In order to really understand the problem, we need to have evidence-based research. So the fact that we don't have that is like a real problem. And again, that's something that Congress could do. It could pass legislation that basically gives the CDC money or other government agencies to do research, right, to do research. And then another component that, we don't always talk about, not everything can be dealt with by the government, right? The government cannot solve all of our problems. So basically what needs to happen is we have to have conversations with communities. We have to have conversations with members from the community, right? If we're going to have solutions, we can't just say, all right, we're going to shut down Chicago. You need to go into those neighborhoods in Chicago. You need to talk to people in those neighborhoods who are impacted and find solutions that basically work for that particular neighborhood, right? So it's not like one size fits all, but you know, that community engagement is kind of an important aspect of it. Possible solutions, right? Possible solutions. Certainly legislation, right? At the federal level, at the state level. But funding for research, right? Funding for research is really important. What are we dealing with here? And we need to have evidence-based research to understand the problem so that then we can come up with solutions. Developing strategies together with local communities, and again, we're talking local communities, but in tandem, in collaboration, you know, with law enforcement, with government officials, with other stakeholders, right? You cannot just go in and say, this is a law enforcement problem only, and this is going to be a law enforcement solution only, right? You need to work together with community members. If you talk to community members, here's just food for thought. A lot of times people get really excited, right? They get upset, tempers flare, and they may try to solve their problems aggressively. We could, for example, train people into, you know, how about nonviolent negotiation of conflict, right? How can we talk to each other differently, right? So there are a lot of different ways to get at this. The bigger problem is, and I mentioned this earlier in the talk, is how do we deal with these systemic issues, right? Poverty in the inner cities. Why do we have a gang violence problem? You know, so it's one thing to say, well, guns are to blame, but if we're really looking at the root causes of it, we're also going to need solutions that are a lot more ambitious and, quite frankly, beyond the scope of this talk. All right, so taking it back to Shirley Chambers, the woman who lost all of her 4 children to homicide. I cannot even imagine, you know, as a mother, I cannot even imagine losing one of my kids to gun violence. It's beyond my comprehension to imagine what she went through, losing all 4 of her kids. And when we talk about gun violence as a problem, and we talk about, you know, potential solutions or, you know, different aspects of gun control, the one thing that I encourage everybody to keep in mind is that it affects people personally, right? And we have to respect that. And we need to be mindful of that, right? It affects people on a very personal level. All right, last but not least, in the way of resources, I was sending around the executive summary of Amnesty International's report, In the Line of Fire, Human Rights and the U.S. Gun Violence Crisis. There's also Centers for Disease Control, Everytown Research, Law Center, Giffords. I mentioned Gabby Giffords before, the Brady Campaign. There are a lot of documents that you can find on the United Nations website. And, you know, a lot of the research that we do have, for example, what's the impact on children, right? What's the impact on women? What's the medical cost for people who are shot? You can find in academic journals, you can find in medical journals, right? So this is not just a matter of opinion, right? And the one thing, you know, let's say even if you're not paralyzed after you've been shot, psychologically, right? If you witness something like that, or if you're part of it, you're going to be traumatized, right? People are going to be suffering from post-traumatic stress. Like all the kids who were in mass shootings that happened at their school, they're going to be traumatized, right? And this is something really, really difficult to deal with. But I hope I've added a little bit to your understanding of gun violence in this country. And if you're interested in finding out more, feel free to stick around. Okay. Thank you.